What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. Let's save a dwarf this week and talk about one of my new favorite games. Last year, I attended Gamma and Adepticon back to back. Both conventions had a lot to show in the world of miniature games. But one game in particular really stood out to me. Conquest, developed by Bellum Games, is a miniature war game that has been around for a couple of years, but until now I haven't really given it much thought. Going to those conventions, however, really changed my mind. Until now, I didn't really know what the game was, and I had only seen a handful of pictures and boxes, and to be completely honest, kinda looked underwhelming. The gameplay seemed pretty stale, and going back to the rank and file days of Warhammer Fantasy really didn't appeal to me all that much. That was until I actually got to play a game. On the surface, it seems pretty simple. Line up your troops and push them together. But where this game really shines, or at least in the demo game that I played, was the alternating activation using a card stack. Each player determines their turn order by stacking cards that represent blocks of troops. Then, once the round begins, reveal which unit will be moving, shooting, or attacking next. Now, I know it seems pretty straightforward, and it actually kind of is, but the feeling of guessing what your opponent is going to do and revealing the proper card before they can make a move is very, very satisfying. On top of that, the models have gotten a huge upgrade in the last year or so, going from a kind of blobby, smooth plastic to the kind of quality we can expect from companies like Games Workshop. The models come on sprues like we normally see in Warhammer or other model games, and they're made from the same material and manufactured in the same way that Games Workshop makes their models. So the quality is really good on these newer models. On top of that, they make command units that stand alone out of resin, like we see from Creature Caster and the like. So you can get some absolutely fantastic models from this company. This brings me to the model we'll be taking a look at this week. This is a Dweghom Hold Ray, a commander for the Dwarven army in Conquest. There are a couple of things I want to point out with this model. First, this is actually a resin model, and it has some really nice detail to it, even though it's kind of covered up with paint right now. Second, it's older, so it's not as nice as some of the newer models. And last week, as I filmed this video, they actually released pictures of the new plastic kit of this model, and it looks really good. And lastly, it's on a special kind of base. Each unit in Conquest is run on, essentially, movement trays. They're square trays that make it easy to push large squads forward on the battlefield and keep them in line to maneuver around your opponent. But you can remove the models from the tray and use them separately for Bellum's skirmish game, Conquest First Blood. Check out the size difference as well. Conquest models are actually 38mm, which I find pretty fascinating because it's a size that still feels rather small and not far off from your average Warhammer model. It's an interesting in-between for tabletop models and 75mm display pieces, and often the larger centerpieces feel like display models, so it hits on both types of painting experiences all in one game. So this model is in a pretty interesting state. It has some parts broken off and some pretty thick paint that will need to be removed before we get to work. I'm going to toss this guy into my sonic cleaner and let him soak before scrubbing off that paint. In the meantime, let's talk about the plan for this model. When I finally decided to take the plunge and buy models for this game, I decided on the Old Dominion faction. It's got a really cool aesthetic, and it looks like an army that I wouldn't mind spending some time painting up. That also means that I don't actually need this dwarf. Luckily, I know someone who has also decided to get into this game at the same time that I have, and he needs this for his dwarf army. I asked old Goobertown Brent himself what kind of colors he wanted to paint his dwarf army, and he let me know that he was thinking of going with either blue and white or green and white. So those are the restrictions for this model. Definitely white and either blue or green as the other main color. Now that we have the model cleaned up, I need to fix the broken pieces. A little bit of cleanup work with an X-Acto blade, and I should be able to join these parts together pretty easily. Resin, especially when it's clean and dry, sticks almost instantly with superglue. Alright, so now he's put together and looking properly placed on the base. Let's get the model primed and lay down a zenithal coat of white ink in order to see the model a bit better. I'm gonna be honest here, this model is kinda weird. The way it was sculpted really draws attention away from the face, which is kind of the opposite of how most models are actually designed these days. Could you even tell that there was a full face on this model before it was stripped down? So I'm gonna need to bring in some brighter dwarf skin to bring as much attention to the face as I can. Of course, a dwarf isn't always about the face. The beard really takes the cake for most of them, so I want to make sure that those hairs are nice and defined as well. It's kind of an interesting problem to solve, but I think we're going to get there in the end. Next up, I'm going to lay down some purple brown for the fur cloak that wraps around his head. Remember, we need to get that face to stand out and create some contrast around the head to really frame it in. Going dark isn't exactly the best option, but I plan on going almost fully white for this fur by the end of it. So starting with a purple brown, I can build up brighter colors to bring in maximum contrast and bring attention to the important details on the model. Or at least, that's the plan. Since Brent didn't exactly know what colors he was going to go for, either blue or green, I decided to make that decision for him and go with a desaturated green. I feel like blue would have been a little much on an entire army, and I don't want the color to be too bright. Personally, I tend to lean towards darker, more desaturated colors when I paint, but this model feels kind of earthy and makes sense to me that there would be some green tones to offset the reddish orange of the beard. So that's where we're going to go with it, and there's nothing Brent can do about it. For the armor, and there is quite a bit of it, I'll start with a medium silver, something not too dark but leaves enough room to really go bright with the highlights. In order to break up that color a bit, I decided to add a little bit of gold from Vallejo metal color. The green hue in that particular gold will help sell that green cloak, and when it comes to bringing in even more contrast and detail for that metallic, we can use some red to really punch that color up. Now that the base coats are laid down, I want to start painting in details and highlighting. Starting with the skin, I like to glaze in a darker skin tone into the shadows. A lot of the time I opt for a reddish wash all over the skin, but for a model that's a little bit bigger and more of a centerpiece, I like to do that by hand. Now it takes a lot longer, but I find that the results are often much nicer. The fact that the model is at a 38mm scale also means that glazing in details on skin is actually quite a bit easier than most Warhammer models. The fingers and muscles on this model are well defined, and that really makes it easy to get in there with a pretty large brush to do the detail work. A lot of the rest of the model is made up of armor and cloth, not a ton of skin showing. I decided to bring in a couple of washes to darken down the model a bit more and blackline a lot of the details. First up will be some Agrax Earthshade for the cloth and the leather, followed up with a Tamiya panel liner for the metallics. Of course, these washes don't mix, so I started with the Earthshade and let that dry before coming back in with the panel liner, and I think it really did the trick in getting those details to stand out. Just a little bit of cleanup with a makeup sponge just to make sure that that liner isn't sitting on any of the flat surfaces, and we should be ready to move on to the detail work. I also decided at this stage to matte varnish the model to really flatten the colors. It does bring all the paints together with the same finish to them, which helps sell the model a bit better, but it also does a number on the metallics. Now, since we are going to come back in with an even brighter silver anyway, I'm not really too worried about it, but keep that in mind if you plan on varnishing your models. You will definitely be painting that metal again. Time to start layering up those details. I'll start by lightening up that beard and bringing those individual strands out. It started off as a kind of reddish orange, so I'll add a little bit more orange to that mix and layer it up. The cloak in particular needs work. The earth shade really darkened it and left a bit of staining. I'll come in with a little bit of that original green and stipple that into the cloak. Instead of layering over it to make the paint smooth, I want these little dots to create texture. Going over the cloak 10 or 15 times like this will really make it look a lot more like cloth, and I can step up that color in the highlights to brighten it up. Since we are going for a green and white color scheme, I want to start bringing that fur cloak up towards white. I'll start by layering in some lighter brown and slowly add ivory to the mix to get brighter and brighter. I want to leave that brown near the base as well to really get that contrast, so I'm kind of treating this like I would paint bone. But instead of picking out the contours and creating stark lines that you would see on bone, I'll do my best to blend the darker brown into the white and make it a more subtle transition, something that fits a fur cloak a little better. In order to bring back that shine on the metallics, I mix up some of the original silver with a bright aluminum. This color, layered over the metal, leaving the recesses untouched, really brings out the individual pieces of armor and livens it up quite a bit. I'll finish the pieces off by edge highlighting with a pure aluminum color to make the edges really shine. The horns on this model are actually really nice. They look way more like real bone than a lot of other sculpted horns that I've painted in the past. I'll start with a wash of sepia to kind of age that white that we already have, and I'll follow that up immediately with some ivory. The wash is still quite wet, so I'm going to wet blend that ivory in to create some really smooth transitions with that color. Even then, I stipple on the color where I want that white to be a little brighter and give the bones a bit more texture. One of the last things I really want to do on this model is bring in some color variation. The cloak is still pretty desaturated, so coming in with a very thin glaze of green ink will saturate that color and keep all of the stippling visible. The beard also needs a bit more shadow in it to give it more shape, so I bring in some purple ink to really tint that color where the beard bends in towards the body. This really does a lot for the model. It just creates more shape and allows the brighter points to stand out even more. This is often a step that I skip as well. Coming in at what feels like the end of a paint job to do the final bit of detail work can seriously be exhausting. It's also completely worth the effort. The entire goal of painting highlights and creating contrast is to point your eye towards something on the model. And if you don't push that contrast on both sides, the highlight and the shadow, then you're missing the part that actually makes that concept work. Now, we always spend time highlighting models, but shading is just as important. And I'm not talking about just wash. Also, I really like how that purple looks on the beard. It's working for me. So the model is pretty much done except for the base. I didn't ask Brent what kind of base he was going to end up doing because I know he hasn't even put paint on any of his models yet. So I'll go with a pretty neutral grass tuft and static grass base that can just be changed by adding things like scenery bits or snow, or whatever color tufts he ends up going with. I've been playing Warhammer for quite some time, and it's only recently that I've begun to look into other game systems and models. For me, the quality of model is very important, because that's where I spend a majority of my time when it comes to tabletop gaming. Whether we like it or not, Games Workshop just makes some of the best models in the business, and as painters, that's really hard to pass up when they come attached to long-running game systems. But Conquest is a game that is finally catching up in terms of quality of miniatures and gameplay that's actually really fun. I've been building models over the last few weeks in anticipation of playing something new and different. And if you're looking for a new tabletop game to play that has models and variety in gameplay, then I highly recommend checking out Conquest. Now right now there isn't a lot on the used market for Conquest, and I ended up picking this guy up for $20, which honestly could have been worse, but it's not the kind of savings that I'm technically used to for larger games like Warhammer. Still, for a resin model that is pretty high quality, I feel pretty good about that. Now that we have finished this mighty dwarf, I'm going to head out to the post office and ship it over to Goobertown. Have a safe journey, little buddy. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here is the completed Dweghom hold ray. Thanks again.